I was trying to sneak up on him so that he wouldn't say very much, but he kept going. Look, as you're aware from our speakers already today, the Australian Christian Lobby desires to see Australia become a nation in which every man, woman and child is valued as God intended. So an important aspect of that freedom is actually freedom from sexual exploitation. God's desire is for children's innocence to be protected, but not only that, but his desire is for human dignity to be extended to all, in light of the fact that human dignity obviously exists only because we are all created in the image of God. But our commitment to human dignity is why I was in the South Australian Parliament last week. I was addressing a group of cross-party members of Parliament about a prostitution bill that they'll be voting on shortly. Probably before the end of the year, but perhaps at the beginning of next year. And I was there advocating on behalf of some of the most vulnerable in our society. But to be perfectly honest with you, as a young woman, I would never have imagined doing that. My husband is, as Dan said, the principal of Malyon Theological College in Brisbane, and when he first entered Baptist ministry, as a young pastor, or close to 30 years ago now, the headquarters of our Queensland Baptist was located very close to Brisbane's red light district, Fortitude Valley. And there were times as a young wife, sometimes with the children in the car, I would need to go in and pick him up after a meeting. And I would drive past women on the side of the road who were soliciting. And I would inwardly and very piously despise them, to my shame. I looked down on them as sinful women who were trying to seduce my husband, and I was disgusted. Let me tell you about a hero of mine. Her name is Josephine Butler. Josephine was born in 1828 in Northumberland in the UK. She grew up in a comfortable and deeply Christian family. Her father, John Gray, was a public advocate for the abolition of slavery. And it was said of John Gray this, it said, he could not endure to see oppression or wrong of any kind inflicted on man, woman or child. Now John Gray was not typical of fathers in his era in that he treated his daughters as equals and he educated them, including on social issues such as the horrors of slavery. So from a young age, Josephine had this deep Christian faith and she felt a calling of God on her life to be a voice for change. She was appalled by the slave trade of young women and children as young as 12 years old from England to Europe for the purpose of prostitution. This is what tugged at her heart. And her campaigning on their behalf led her to visit brothels and also jails. But that decision to enter brothels, and not only that, but to advocate for prostitutes, was actually shocking to her society. She had mud and excrement thrown at her in the street. But she viewed this as a war, and she called this war a consecrated rebellion. Now, this gave her great confidence as she faced down the thugs, the public ridicule and the slander, because she knew that whatever opposition she received, it did not equate to what women caught in prostitution were enduring. Now, unlike my younger self, Josephine saw the desperation that led women to prostitute themselves. And she wrote this about her experiences in the brothels. She wrote, "Hell hath opened her mouth. I stand in the near presence of the powers of evil. What I see and hear are the smoke of the pit." Now, Josephine married George Butler, and he was a scholar and a clergyman, and like her father, George also treated her as an equal, fully supporting her campaigns. That was a very wise marriage. George worked at Oxford University, but it was here that Josephine was shocked and confronted with a deeply ingrained double standard for men and women. There was a respected Oxford scholar who seduced, he was a tutor actually, he seduced a young girl who was at the university, and she ended up pregnant. She was left destitute and in a desperate situation, and when she delivered her baby, she actually killed her newborn, not knowing how else to survive. And she was put in jail because of her crime. Now, Josephine obviously didn't excuse that crime, but she was enraged with the tutor, who was an older man. He had power, connections and authority, and he had taken advantage of the young girl. He lost none of his power, connections or authority. The girl's guilt was undeniable, but Josephine was angered that while she was punished, the man who created the situation retained public respect and he faced no consequences. So once that young girl had finished her jail time, Josephine and George hired her to work in their home, and they rescued her in that way from a very certain dark future. Josephine's work forced her to speak against the mindset and actions common to men of her time. But can I say to you, and I love this about Josephine, because she did not oppose men. And that would have been unthinkable to Josephine. What she did oppose publicly was the all too common belief of her time that men who used prostitutes were simply indulging a natural impulse. And I'm sad to say that belief remains prevalent today. Josephine said this. She said, "It seems strange that I should have been engaged in taking up the cudgel against men when my father, brothers, husband, and sons have all been so good." And I very closely identify with that. My father was the best father a girl could ever wish for. He died in February this year, and I miss him every day still. My husband is godly, faithful, and kind. My son and my 2 sons-in-law are good men, my brothers-in-law, the men I work with. Dan Flynn, Martin Isles, they are godly men. And it's because I understand where she's coming from, and because I have a knowledge of good men, that has spurred me on, as I believe it has spurred her on, to advocate for change in ungodly attitudes for the sake of those who are not as blessed as I am or as she was. But it was not Josephine's husband or father or son that had the most impact on her. Rather, it was another man, and that man obviously has had the most impact on me as well, and the man I refer to is Jesus himself. In his tender and respectful attitude towards women, including prostituted women, we see a vastly different way to view womanhood and redemption than we see in the world. Josephine Butler's influence was vast. She successfully changed aspects of the prostitution legislation in her day, and she was also responsible for raising the age of consent to 16. As part of her strategy, Josephine helped set up an organisation to lobby government against the legislative system of the day, and her organisation was called the Ladies National Association. If she'd been in Australia, I'm sure she would have called it the Australian Christian Lobby. But the group lobbied against legislation that officially sanctioned a double standard of sexual morality, that's how she saw it, justifying male sexual access to prostitutes whilst penalising women for engaging in the act of prostitution. And this is not a new issue, it's not a new problem. In the Bible, we actually read, if you'll remember, of Jacob's son Judah taking advantage of someone he thought was a prostitute beside the road. A short time later, he discovered that Tamar, his widowed daughter-in-law, was pregnant. And Judah was so angry with her immorality that he actually ordered for her to be brought out and burned. Imagine his shame when it was revealed that it was he who had made Tamar pregnant. But back to Josephine, just very briefly. On the 31st of December 1869, Josephine's organisation published a statement in the Daily News that it had been formed to lobby for the repeal of the obnoxious, she called them, laws that allowed men to access prostitutes but penalised the women who prostituted themselves. Now, that statement was signed by 124 women, and one of them was the social reformer Florence Nightingale. Special. Josephine died on the 30th of December 1906, and she had accomplished so much, but there is so much more to be done. And a new generation of advocates have actually risen up to take up the cause. And on behalf of ACL, my involvement stems from the fact that, like Josephine, I had a home where I was loved and protected and guided, and because my husband is faithful and good, and because there but by the grace of God go I. We acknowledge that it is not only women exploited in prostitution, but over 97% of prostitution is men buying women. And when we legalise prostitution, we are actually legalising abuse. Can I just give you a few stats? 70% of women involved in prostitution for more than 2 years suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Over 90% of prostitutes use drugs to cope with their physical pain and to help them disassociate. Most women leaving prostitution never re-enter the full-time workforce because of mental health issues. 95% of women in prostitution say they would exit the industry if they could. And there's also been a long-term French study done that found a prostitute's life expectancy is reduced by 60% compared to the general population. Now in Victoria, your prostitution was legalised in 1994. Your brothels are regulated through Consumer Affairs Victoria, as are estate agents and actually motor vehicle traders. The aim of the 1994 legislation was to remove the criminal element in the industry. But in 2010, your government felt the need to conduct an inquiry into people being trafficked for sex work, and it was because of the growth in the illicit trade in women for sexual purposes, and that was particularly in Melbourne-based brothels. The majority of cases of sexual servitude and trafficking cases in Australia are being heard in Victorian criminal courts at the moment. Academics argue that it is the legalisation of brothels and other forms of prostitution that has led to this increase in sex trafficking in Victoria, and that legalisation creates the conditions required for the rapid expansion of the industry, which in turn creates the need for the supply chain of vulnerable women through trafficking. The crime of trafficking women is extremely lucrative. It is equal in value to illegal arms trading and second only to drug trafficking. So slavery in all its forms, you will have heard this, I'm sure, is more prolific today than even when William Wilberforce and his fellow abolitionists brought about its demise in the 1700s. And close to 70% of the world's slaves are actually found in our Southeast Asian region. So in acknowledgement of this, Australia signed what was the United Nations Palermo Protocol, which includes this statement. It says this: state parties shall adopt or strengthen legislative or other measures, such as educational, social or cultural measures, including bilateral and multilateral cooperation, to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of exploitation of persons, especially women and children, that leads to trafficking. So Josephine Butler's approach to prostitution legislation is actually very similar to the Nordic model of prostitution legislation, which has now been adopted in a number of countries, including Sweden, Norway, it's in Iceland, Northern Ireland, Canada, France is one of the latest, South Korea and Ireland. And it's the legislation that ACL is actually campaigning for, because we believe it actually best supports human dignity and follows Jesus' example of reaching out in love to the most vulnerable. I'm not going to spend a long time on it, but the Nordic approach to prostitution decriminalises those who are prostituted. It provides support services to help them exit, and that's one of the most important parts of the legislation. And it makes buying people for sex a criminal offence in order to reduce the demand that drives sex trafficking. So we're trying to cut off that supply. And we will continue to lobby in every Australian state for this approach to legislation. As I say, at the moment, they are looking at it in South Australia, but I know that there are many people talking in your state as well. But another form of exploitation that goes hand in hand, and a lot of this all is tied in together with prostitution and trafficking, is pornography. Based on the exploitation of girls and women worldwide, pornography is also a very lucrative industry. It's currently worth an estimated $100 billion globally. Now, if I can put that into perspective for you, because it's hard to sort of imagine $100 billion, but the pornography industry brings in more revenue than Microsoft and around twice the combined revenue of Google, eBay, Yahoo and Netflix. The prevalence of pornography in our culture and the diabolical damage it leaves in its wake is why ACL's research director that we've heard from already today, Dr. Elizabeth Taylor. Where is Elizabeth again now? She's probably grabbing lunch. Oh, she's pointing. Dr. Elizabeth Taylor undertook an extensive research project on pornography as a health issue. We've got copies of it outside if you would like to grab a copy. The main reason we did this is not really for you, although it's online as well as a PDF. There's certainly nothing explicit in photographs or anything in this, but the information is concerning, and obviously it's not a coffee table book, but we've done it mainly to circulate to our members of parliament so that we can actually start to shift the cultural norms around the acceptance of pornography. So please feel free to take a copy today. You're very welcome to do so, because it is really important that as Christians we take a stand on this and call it for what it is. It is an abomination. It is a lie. It is a lie that destroys the consumers. It is a lie that shatters relationships with family, with spouses, and even with God. It is a lie that is reshaping our understanding of sexuality as God intended. And sadly, in a room of this size, there is very little doubt that some of you will be personally affected by pornography. And I don't say that to be judgmental, quite the opposite, because the message of Christ is always one of redemption. But as God's people, we cannot possibly entertain something that grieves the heart of God. Jesus speaks about the issue of pornography to his followers in the way that he says this. He said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." I've had church leaders say to me, I've had a problem with pornography, but I'm doing pretty well. I'm down to about once a month. And I have been so shocked because what we're really saying is, I'm only committing adultery once a month. And we think that's okay. Jesus said, if your right arm offends you, cut it off. And I would say to people today, if you are having a trouble with pornography, stop it. Stop it. The message of today's pornography is that women enjoy being degraded, hurt, injured, and insulted, and this is diametrically opposed to Jesus' attitude towards women and how he commands his followers to behave. We are called to be salt and light in a world that is obviously fraught with dangers, and I would say especially for our young people. And yes, I am a grandmother, and the ramifications, I would say, are most serious of all for our children. In 2015, Telstra announced that the average age of first smartphone ownership was then 12, so that's in 2015. And with pornography readily available via smartphones, there is no question that this generation has more access to pornography than anyone in human history ever. And it's accessible 24/7. Close to 70% of pornography viewing is actually happening on a smartphone. In the 3 years between 2008 and 2011, as the smartphone became more and more available, the percentage of children under the age of 13 exposed to pornography jumped from 14% to 49%. So then it's not surprising that Australian Bureau of Statistics figures show that sexual offences committed by school-aged children quadrupled from 430 in 2007 to 1,709 in 2011. And those are the latest statistics I have. So you can only imagine what we're looking at now, because the average age of first exposure to pornography is now 11 years old. And that's often by accident. Back in 2007, again, note that we're talking more than a decade ago, there was a study done by internet security company McAfee. And they revealed that there was a 1 in 14 chance back then of a child typing in a misspelled URL. 1 in 14 is pretty high. We're talking 2007. Typing in a misspelled URL and stumbling upon a porn site by accident. Imagine what it would be now. But I want to be clear. Clicking on exploitative material might be an accident by the user, particularly if it's a child, but it is a carefully planned marketing move by an industry that preys on the vulnerable, because there is huge financial incentive for getting users hooked on this content, and even from a very young age, and it makes me very angry. And so this is why ACL continues to lobby our federal government particularly to introduce a UK-style safe feed internet. In the UK, the major internet service providers have all voluntarily opted into a system that the government actually promoted, and it is an opt-in system rather than opt-out. So what this means is that their default is clean. So it's safe for children from the start. So if children get a smartphone or a laptop or an iPad, the default is that it is a safe feed. You don't have to add on extra filters. Our default here in Australia is that you get everything. So when you get your smartphone or anything and you want to put filters on, you've got to add them on. So what we've been lobbying the government for is that any adult content should be able to be opted in to receive by an adult, but the clean feed should be the default for every new piece of technology. Because when it's the opposite, parents have to be vigilant all the time, continually ensuring that their filters are up to date and that people aren't getting around it and getting to their children, targeting them with inappropriate content, which is happening all of the time. So in Queensland, where I come from, I'm currently in talks with our health department, who have been tasked by the government in terms of all of this sort of stuff that we're trying to keep our children safe from. Our government has tasked our health department to remove junk food advertising from near schools, sporting facilities, and also transport hubs. And when I saw that, I thought it's quite a good idea. We're, trying to protect our children from foods that could cause them problems with obesity. That's really what they're worried about. But how much more important it is to protect them from sexual content. So I went to the government and the health department and I said, if you can ban junk food advertising, you can also ban inappropriate sexual advertising. And the great thing is that they're actually listening to us. So that's a really good thing. Yeah. So we're going to continue to push back against the perversion of sexuality in all of its forms, whether that be prostitution, pornography, the internet minefield, or inappropriate advertising in our public spaces. And I would just ask the question of you, why do you think that it's so important to us? I think it's an obvious question to answer, but it is because God has made clear his intention for humanity in his word to us. God's way is truth. And we are called to be bearers of his truth, because it is truth that brings freedom and justice and righteousness. And his word tells us that when truth has stumbled in the public square, honesty cannot enter. And it also says that when truth has stumbled in the public square, honesty cannot enter, justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away. And so I'm going to end my message to you today with some thoughts from God's word, and I would ask you to please allow them to speak to your heart. A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls. I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a young woman. Flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. Submit yourselves to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Flee from sexual immorality. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. With my whole heart I seek you. Let me not wander from your commandments. I have stored up your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety. And after the end of a long day of hearing a lot of information and a lot of consideration of many things that ACL stands up against, all of them so very important, this last verse. Finally, whatever is true, whatever is honourable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. God bless you each one. Thank you.